Disgusting. Pathetic loser reincarnates with godly magical powers. A common man opens his eyes, but he looks to be in great agony. As tears fall from his eyes, he looks around to see people jeering and laughing at him. A prince decides to give him a parting gift before he takes his life. He asks the commoner to strike out with his magic, and the man desperately tries to attack the prince. He raises his arms to shoot a mighty flame at the prince, but he can only manage a weak flame that hardly causes damage to the prince. Everyone makes fun of his flimsy magic, and the prince can't believe there's a commoner who's so weak. He's disappointed that was all a commoner could manage. He recounts the words of a great sage called William Bordeaux, who said the most important things for a mage are lineage, talent, and intelligence. But he tells the commoner not to get the wrong idea because diligence is a broader prerequisite, and no amount of it can make up for a lack of talent. He begins preparing his attack as he tells the commoner that magic will never smile upon someone as insignificant as him. He releases his flame magic on the commoner, who's immediately consumed by them. He screams in agony as the flames burn him to ashes, and then he immediately begins to smile at the magnificence of a royal's magic. He realizes the power behind the magic a noble wields, and he can't help but admire its beauty. From his magical perspective, he wishes he had learned more about magic and mastered it while he was alive. With his last breath, he prays for another chance to experience the thrill of such magic. He suddenly wakes up, and he sees himself surrounded by maids holding toys. He wonders who they are and where he is. He thinks they are giant enemies and decides to protect himself. He tries to cast a fire spell to defend himself, but realizes his hands are quite tiny. He accidentally casts a fire spell which bursts through the roof of the castle. As fireworks go off, marking his birth, a town crier runs through the kingdom, announcing the birth of the 7th prince of the Saloum Kingdom while sharing posters. Everyone in the village is happy to witness such a great day. Meanwhile, the maids at the castle are mind blown by the disaster caused by the newborn baby. The baby smiles cheekily, proud of his handiwork in the destruction of the castle. Some years later, the people in the kingdom go about their normal activities while some maids search for the prince in the castle. They search a portion of the castle and can't find him, so they decide to move their search to another portion of the castle. The prince comes out of hiding after they leave, and he's about to sneak away from the castle when he's greeted by 2 men. Prince Lloyd stops in his tracks and shushes the man so the maids don't hear them calling his name. He tells the man to deny seeing him, and the man agrees to keep his secret. He asks Lloyd if he'll like to tag along with them as they go to hunt, but Lloyd leaves him talking to himself. When the man realizes that Lloyd is trying to sneak away, he calls out to him, but Lloyd doesn't answer. The man is disappointed that the prince has run off again, but his friend informs him that Lloyd is the 7th prince, which makes him out of contention for the crown. He doesn't understand why the man is going through so much effort to gain his favor. The man reminds his friend that the prince was able to speak shortly after his birth, read spell books instead of children's picture books, and also refused breast milk like any gentleman would. He tells his friend he thinks the prince is a reincarnation of the great sage William Bordeaux. His friend tells him it's ridiculous to think the prince is a reincarnation of the great sage. The prince runs down the steps in the castle, and he realizes the man is right about him being a reincarnation. He remembers he was a commoner in his past life, but he doesn't know why his memories are still intact. As the maids look for him in the castle, he wonders why he was reborn as someone privileged to be the 7th son of a royal family. Though he was born as royalty, he doesn't plan to follow their ambitions of glory. He decides to stick to his ambitions from his previous life and find out how much awesome magic can be discovered in the palace. He enters the royal library, and he's excited to parse through all the magical books lining the shelves. He takes a book off the shelf and opens it up, but someone immediately appears behind him. Silpha takes the book from his hands, pissed to find him after he ran away from the maids. They engage in swordplay, and Lloyd is able to hold his own against her for a while, but she eventually pushes him back. He tells her he doesn't have a shot at the throne since he's the 7th, hence he doesn't need sword instructions. Silpha tells him there's more to life than succession to the throne. She reminds him that he has to be familiar with handling a sword as a member of the royal family. It was her purpose in life to make him adept with the sword after she was placed in charge of his education 3 years ago. Lloyd realizes that Silpha won't let him stop training unless he puts up a good show. They decide to resume their sword practice, and Silpha realizes that Lloyd is getting stronger with each passing day. Lloyd isn't bothered by her compliment because he knows she is holding back. He is also secretly using control-type magic to trace Silpha's movements, so she is battling a mirror image of herself. He is basically cheating so he can get out of practice and go back to his books. They continue sparring, but Silpha still gets the best out of him. Lloyd realizes that though Silpha still surpasses him in arm strength, stamina, and height, though he can copy her techniques, he is still at a disadvantage against her, which would make him lose. He decides to experiment with cheating to compensate for his disadvantages against her. He uses magic to increase his sword length and his physical strength. He also uses levitation to make up for the height difference. He re-engages Silpha, and this time he's able to keep up with her. He's confident he'll be able to win with his magic enhancements. They continue their sword practice, but Lloyd decides to use his trump card to make an unexpected move. He releases his trace magic, which mirrors Silpha's movements, and he tries to strike her from behind. Silpha looks surprised, and Lloyd is happy he'll be able to get back to his book, but Silpha blocks his attack. She wonders if he was cheating, which catches him by surprise, and she's able to knock his sword out of his hands. She's surprised he thought she wouldn't notice his cheating schemes. She tells him he's so talented for trying to make up for his disadvantages. She's surprised he was able to use 2 spells at once, which most court magicians can't even manage. She tells him not to rush his growth, but to grow at his own pace. Lloyd realizes she didn't notice his physical enhancement and his control spells because he was actually using 4 spells at once. He decides to keep this information from her so she doesn't suspect him. Silpha takes him to the maid bath, but Lloyd protests, telling her he can bathe himself. Silpha doesn't want to let him out of her sight because she'll only find him under a pile of books. Lloyd is disappointed he doesn't get to read his book, but the other maids tell him the library demon will gobble him up if he remains stubborn. Lloyd is surprised there's a library with a forbidden demon. The maids recount the tale of the demon named Grimoire, who also destroyed the kingdom a long time ago. It took several sages to seal the demon away in a book. Silpha thinks the story is a fairy tale because she can't believe there's a book in the castle's underground library where the monster is sealed. Silpha doesn't think Lloyd will be scared by such a tale, but she's surprised to see him trembling. The maids offer to sleep with him through the night, but Silpha tells them she's the only one that can perform that role. An argument ensues between the maids, and Lloyd uses that opportunity to sneak away. The idea of a forbidden underground library in the castle makes his eyes sparkle with anticipation. Lloyd goes underground, and he uses a concealment spell to get through the guards guarding the entrance. The guards argue about the authenticity of the tale behind the library as Lloyd sneaks past them. They're convinced no one will be able to sneak past them and break the seal cast by the 10 most powerful mages the kingdom has ever seen. Lloyd arrives at the barrier, and he breaks the seal easily. He enters into the library, and he can't believe he never knew such an exciting section existed underground. He moves through the library, checking out the books, and he reminds himself to put up the barrier when he's leaving. He settles down with a book when another book suddenly starts levitating, which surprises Lloyd. A demon emerges from the book, and he tells Lloyd he's impressed he was able to break the seal. Lloyd wonders who the demon is, and the demon introduces himself as Grimoire. Lloyd figures out that he's the demon of the Forbidden Book. Lloyd introduces himself to Grimoire, and Grimoire tries to convince Lloyd to free him. He tells Lloyd his seal is already degraded and he'll eventually be free. He offers to give Lloyd as much gold as he wants if he frees him, but Lloyd isn't impressed with the demon's creation magic. He's disappointed Grimoire just molded some dust into gold, and he crushes the gold back into dust easily, which surprises Grimoire. Lloyd tells him he plans to replace his seal because he doesn't want a demon to destroy his plans of learning the magic of the kingdom. Grimoire tries to convince him that he has no beef with the citizens because the sages who sealed him are long gone, but Lloyd doesn't believe him. Grimoire becomes desperate, and he offers to teach Lloyd some ancient magic that has been lost to time. This piques Lloyd's interest, and Grimoire tells him he will teach him because he can see he has a lot of magic talent. Lloyd remembers the words of the prince who said magic would never smile on him because he's a commoner. He's now convinced he has a body more privileged in magic than a mere commoner. He decides to release the demon's seal, and the demon can't believe his luck. Lloyd anticipates the teachings of the demon, and the demon decides to keep his word. He immediately strikes Lloyd with ancient flame magic and decides to move on with his escape, thinking he has taken Lloyd down. He's surprised to see Lloyd safe and sound because he uses a barrier to protect himself. Lloyd is intrigued by the spell cast by the demon, and he asks the demon to show him more. The demon is pissed by this and hits Lloyd with more powerful ancient magic spells, but none of them can penetrate through Lloyd's barrier. The demon is baffled by this, and he wonders what Lloyd's barrier is made of. Lloyd is so fascinated by the magic that he decides to try it for himself. He takes the remnants on his barrier and holds it on his finger so he can observe its composition. He excitedly awaits what more Grimoire can offer when suddenly Grimoire grows a second mouth and starts chanting. Lloyd notices his double incantation to release a devastating ancient spell. Lloyd analyzes the spell from within his barrier, but Grimoire can't believe Lloyd is still alive after being on the receiving end of his most powerful spell. Grimoire decides to put his tail between his legs and run for his life, but he's stopped by a barrier. Lloyd informs him that he put up a barrier, but Grimoire is hurt that Lloyd thought he was trying to run away. He tells Grimoire he just put up the barrier as a preventive measure. Grimoire has had enough with Lloyd, so he decides to finish him off, but Lloyd tells him he already knows his spell. Lloyd decides to test Grimoire's defensive magic, and he casts a huge spell. Grimoire can't believe Lloyd has such a huge mana reservoir. He tries to dodge the fire spell, but he's inevitably burnt to a crisp. Lloyd wonders why Grimoire wasn't able to dodge his attack, and Grimoire can't believe he's so arrogant. Lloyd decides to repair the damage to the library, and Grimoire is dumbfounded because he was able to restore the room so perfectly. He decides to treat Lloyd with respect since he's so amazing. Lloyd knows that demons can't be taken out with magic, so he decides to test Grimoire's limits. But Grimoire moves away from him with dread. He decides to surrender himself and pledge his services to Lloyd. He asks to serve as Lloyd's familiar, and Lloyd immediately agrees. But Grimoire feels like Lloyd sees him as a lab rat. Lloyd tells him he stands out too much, and he asks him to transform into something smaller. Grimoire transforms into a little cute demon with the aim of buttering Lloyd up so he can take him down unawares. Lloyd invites him to jump into his coat, and Grimoire can't believe Lloyd is so stupid that he'll let him get intimate. He decides to use the opportunity to attach himself to Lloyd and take over his body. But as soon as he touches Lloyd, he's surprised by how dense Lloyd's mana is. He decides to be obedient to Lloyd because he can't see himself taking control of him. Lloyd uses the opportunity to read all the books in the Forbidden Library. Albert gets dressed for the day, and he proceeds to the library with the servants prostrating to him. Lloyd is reading some books in the library with Grimoire keeping him company when Albert arrives at the door. Grimoire alerts Lloyd of Albert's presence as he opens the door, and Lloyd tells him to hide. Albert walks into the room, and Lloyd is so excited to see him that he raises his head too fast, which makes the book on his head fly into Albert's hand. Lloyd sits and watches enthusiastically as Albert prepares to practice at the testing range. He uses his fire magic to take down a target to the amazement of the spectators. Lloyd applauds his effort while Grimoire can't believe he gets to witness the second prince of the kingdom in action. Lloyd informs him that Albert is so smart and physically capable that people refer to him as the next potential king. This gives him authority to access various facilities in the castle, and Lloyd is always happy when Albert invites him to tag along, because that's the only time he's allowed to use his magic. Lloyd gets off the bench, and Albert informs him that it's his turn to have a go at the practice range. Lloyd walks over to the line, but he realizes that he shouldn't look so impressive so people won't think he's in contention for the throne. All he wants to do is study magic without drawing anyone's attention to him. He decides to make his fireball graze all the targets instead of hitting them squarely, but Grimoire tells him people will notice that it is harder to pull off. Lloyd decides to stick to his idea, and he makes his fireballs graze the targets. Everyone applauds his effort, but one of them teases him for only being able to graze the target. Grimoire is pissed by this because he knows it's harder to make the fireballs graze the target. Meanwhile, Lloyd is assessing the pros and cons of his technique, and Grimoire realizes he's addicted to magic knowledge. Albert decides to take a break, and he leaves Lloyd at the practice range to let loose. The servants follow Albert, which makes Lloyd delighted to have the whole gallery to himself. He decides to try out so many ideas that he has been holding in. Grimoire wonders what he'll try, and Lloyd tells him he's going to try out his double incantation magic. Grimoire tries to deter him because only demons can do the double incantation trick since they have two mouths. Lloyd decides to absorb Grimoire into his hand, but he's surprised it works. Grimoire doesn't feel comfortable being assimilated into Lloyd's body. Lloyd decides to try and sync up with him so they can cast an advanced fire spell. Lloyd wonders if Grimoire can cast it, and Grimoire reminds him that advanced spells are child's play to him because he's a demon. Lloyd realizes he'll be able to cast it, and they begin casting it together. They barely say the full incantation before Grimoire gets sick. Lloyd wonders what's wrong with him, and Grimoire tells him he should be the one questioning his actions. He wonders what incantation Lloyd is saying, and Lloyd tells him it was a spell stack. Spell stacking is a way of abbreviating spells that require incantations to reduce their cast time. He explains to Grimoire that he was trying to cast 100 spells at once using that methodology. Grimoire is surprised by this because spell stacking doesn't work that way. He reminds Lloyd that a single spell stack can only comprise a maximum of 3 spells at once. Lloyd is bummed out because it would take an eternity to cast the incantation of the spell he wants. Lloyd decides to take over Grimoire's mouth on his palm, but he also tries out his own to make sure he can talk through both at the same time. Grimoire wonders if he's about to try out 2 advanced spell incantations at the same time, but Lloyd shuts him up because he needs his mouth. He begins casting the incantation, while Grimoire wonders how he's able to cast 2 different advanced spells at the same time. He realizes that Lloyd is folding 2 forms of magic, and he's impressed by Lloyd's mana reserve. Grimoire keeps observing Lloyd as he does the double incantation, but he realizes the spell will be too powerful to point at anything, let alone a target. Lloyd finishes casting the incantation, and a powerful beam is cast upwards. The beam is so powerful that it catches the attention of everyone in the kingdom. Prince Albert's attendants wonder why he gives Lloyd so much attention, and Albert realizes they don't have an eye for talent. He tells them that Lloyd made his fireball graze all the targets in the same way intentionally, which makes him a magic prodigy. He tells them Lloyd could become a great sage one day, which will make him a vital asset to his future. The attendants aren't surprised he wants a great sage in his service since he could be the king in the future. Albert tells them he just wants to get along with his little brother. He tells them his brother should have taken down the targets in the training room by now, but his attendant tells him he's over-exaggerating. He looks out the window and sees the sky is dark. He wonders why the sun is already setting at noon. Meanwhile, Grimoire is shaking in his boots, his hands as he looks at the result of Lloyd's spell. He's surprised his spell blew a hole in the sky to change it from noon to night. Lloyd marvels at his work before he realizes what he has done. He hastily dispels his spell so the sky can return to normal. Grimoire wonders what Lloyd is made of while Lloyd is glad he was able to revert his spell. The next day, Grimoire picks up the daily papers, and he reads the story about the blast in the sky made by Lloyd. He informs Lloyd about the story, but another story catches his eye. He tells Grimoire about the story of a ranked adventuring companies clearing difficult dungeons and collecting treasures. He's enchanted by the treasure the adventurers get, and he decides to head out to a dungeon. He begins walking like a hypnotized zombie while Grimoire does his best to stop him to no avail. Grimoire tells him everyone in the castle will freak out if he goes missing, but Lloyd tells him there's nothing a little magic can't solve. He shows Grimoire an acorn and uses a plant spell to form a replica of himself. Grimoire is impressed by this, but Lloyd decides to flex more and show Grimoire how sophisticated the replica is. Grimoire is convinced Lloyd will be able to slip out of the castle since he has such a good replica. Lloyd tells him his issue with using the replica is fooling Silpha. He remembers when she told him he grew by 7 himi, which surprised him. Grimoire is also surprised by how attentive she is, and Lloyd tells him he won't be able to fool her with a replica that dances like a dummy. He decides to make Grimoire inhabit the replica while he leaves the castle. He successfully escapes the castle, and he decides to place a call to Grimoire. For some reason, his magical call requires a phone signal, but let's not talk about that. He asks Grimoire how things are looking on his end, and Grimoire tells him he's doing his best to represent him. The maids stare at Lloyd through the door, surprised that he's paying attention to his looks for the first time. Grimoire realizes that Lloyd's idea to transfer his consciousness to his replica was ingenious. Lloyd tells him to watch out for Silpha while doing his best impression of him. Grimoire checks out the replica he's inhabiting, and he's surprised that it has mana circulation. He immediately gets an idea and realizes that he can do whatever he wants now that Lloyd is out of the picture. He smiles like a maniac as he thinks about all the things he can do. Lloyd suddenly calls out to him and tells him he's counting on him to do his best. Grimoire is so touched by this that he's too stunned to speak. Lloyd calls out to him again, and Grimoire tells him that he'll do his best till he gets back. Lloyd keeps flying, but he looks around and stops. Though he was able to leave the castle without trouble, he realizes that he has no idea where to find a dungeon. He stays levitating, trying to think about his next move, when he suddenly notices some movement on the ground. A lady is being chased by some orcs, and Grimoire informs him that someone is in danger. The lady suddenly stops and turns around to face the orcs. She takes them down easily in seconds, and Lloyd realizes she's a martial artist from her battle style. He notices her breathing technique, and he's impressed by it. The lady stands triumphantly over the orcs, and she tells them to try their luck again in another 100 years. Lloyd remembers a book that talked about people in foreign countries who channel their inner energy, called Kai, to create incredible techniques. The lady notices Lloyd hiding from her, and she calls out to him. Lloyd is surprised she was able to notice him from such a far distance, but he decides to meet her and ask her about her techniques and dungeons. Grimoire tells him that the lady may recognize him as the 7th prince if he goes out to meet her. Since the lady doesn't get a response from Lloyd, she decides to take him as her enemy. She rushes at him to attack him, but Lloyd hastily changes his appearance. She comes up to Lloyd, and he introduces himself as Robert, a rookie adventurer. He created an illusion from a mixture of his image and his brother's image to create an authentic appearance. The lady introduces herself to him as Tao, a B-rank adventurer and a martial artist. Lloyd wonders if she suspects his disguise, but Grimoire tells him the illusion is perfect. Meanwhile, Tao is falling head over heels for Robert, because no male has paid her any attention since she left her dojo. She is glad she finally found someone interesting, and she decides to make Lloyd her boyfriend even if hell has to freeze over. Lloyd tells her he wanted them to explore a dungeon together, but if she doesn't feel like it, he'll find someone else. She immediately tells him they can explore a dungeon together, and they head over to a dungeon entrance. Immediately, they enter the dungeon, and Tao takes down several monsters trying to impress Lloyd, but he's more interested in the glowing rocks scattered all over the cave floor. Tao must have felt bad that a male was more interested in smooth rocks than he was in her. They move deeper into the cave, and Lloyd wonders why Tao is adventuring alone. She tells him she hasn't found suitable comrades yet. They take a break inside the dungeon to prepare some refreshments, and Lloyd asks her about her Kai technique. Tao is surprised he knows about Kai since not many people know about the technique on his continent. He tells her that Kai is just like mana for sorcerers, and he also tells her he noticed her breathing technique. She tells him that the breathing technique is fundamental to Kai mastery, which allows a human to gain explosive power. She tells him that it takes time to hone breathing techniques, but she looks at him surprised to see that he's practicing the breathing technique. He suddenly chokes, and Tao tells him he can't practice the breathing techniques carelessly because he could hurt himself. Lloyd noticed that he felt an energy force different from his mana, and he realizes he can use the energy to increase his magic power. Tao decides to teach him more about the Kai technique, and he thanks her for the free tutelage. Her heart suddenly skips a beat, but she sternly tells Lloyd to keep up his breathing technique to hide her reaction. Grimoire can't believe that Lloyd cares about anything other than learning magic. He's about to have some dessert when Silpha suddenly shows up behind him. which surprises him. Tao demonstrates a Kai blast to Lloyd as she takes down a gray wolf, which she thinks is the boss of the dungeon. She tells him they can now open the chest of the dungeon, but she warns him that the treasure may be underdeveloped because the dungeon isn't high level. Lloyd is intrigued by the system of the dungeon, and Tao notices this. They approach the chest, and Tao notices that Lloyd has almost fully mastered the breathing technique. She's glad she got herself a keeper, and she's sure even her strict grandpa would approve of Lloyd. She decides to do her best to make sure that Lloyd remains by her side. But Lloyd is more interested in the opening of the chest than her delusive thoughts. Tao opens the chest, and she's almost sliced in half by an energy blade. But Lloyd saves her as the blade cuts through the dungeon floor where she was standing a moment before. A lick rises up menacingly from beneath the chest, which surprises Tao, but Lloyd is hyped to face a new boss as his eyes glow with anticipation. The lick stands tall before Tao and Lloyd, but Lloyd isn't familiar with the monster, so he asks Tao about it. Tao tells him he has nothing to worry about, and she tries to convince him to head out, but Lloyd is bent on watching her defeat the monster. Tao suddenly uses her technique to blast Lloyd out of the cave. She's convinced that the blast will take him to the entrance, and she hopes he doesn't break too many bones on the way. The lick suddenly starts attacking her, but she manages to dodge its attacks. She wonders why a high-level monster is dwelling in a low-level cave. She realizes that the lick will be difficult to deal with, so much so that even a rank adventurer would have a hard time. She decides to buy as much time as possible so that Lloyd can return to the entrance of the dungeon safely. Lloyd is flying through the air, propelled by the energy of the blast. He's adamant about leaving the dungeon because he wants to learn more about Kai. He decides to create a barrier around him, which reduces his momentum from the blast. He eventually comes to a stop, sadly cursing two little goblins on the dungeon floor with his barrier. Lloyd wonders if it'll be right for him to go back since he doesn't know why Tao decided to send him away. He asks Grimoire for his opinion, but he doesn't get any response. He thinks he has gone out of range of their magic link, but Grimoire suddenly answers him in a small voice, begging him to return as soon as possible. Grimoire begs him for help, and Lloyd contemplates leaving the dungeon after all. Tao is still facing the lick, but she's barely hanging on. She realizes that there's no way she'll win the battle against the Lich, so she decides to back off slowly before the Lich notices. The Lich suddenly realizes she's using Kai, and he informs her that he previously consumed someone who used the technique. He tells her that Kai techniques are nothing but an inferior form of sorcery. By consuming adventurers, he was able to gain their skills and knowledge, but he tells Tao she's not worth consuming. The Lich is more interested in Lloyd because he can react fast enough to dodge his attack. She realizes that though Lloyd and the Lich are both pursuers of knowledge, they are nothing alike. She's happy that unlike most people, Lloyd could see the importance of Kai and the potential power of the techniques it generates. She decides to use her breathing technique, and she attacks the Lich, but it creates a barrier that blocks her attack. Tao tries her best to break the barrier with her techniques because she has trained so hard since she was a little kid. She sacrificed her time and freedom just to master the technique, and she wasn't going to let the Lich make a mockery of her abilities. She uses everything she has, and she punches a hole through the barrier. She releases an energy beam that hits the Lich, and she's convinced she was able to defeat it. Tao is exhausted because she used up too much of her energy and put everything into a point-blank Kai blast. She falls on her knees, unable to move a muscle, but the Lich suddenly speaks up, levitating over her. He is disappointed that she used up all her energy just to break a flimsy barrier that he put up. He informs her that her life is worthless because he has a spell that surpasses the most powerful energy she can generate after her years of practicing Kai techniques. The Lich casts the spell, but he's shocked to see the spell breaking apart. The spell is dispelled, and the Lich is surprised to see Lloyd standing beside Tao, protecting her with a barrier. Lloyd is disappointed that Tao gave up already, but he tells her he'll take care of the Lich. Though he's in a hurry, he decides to have some fun. The Lich is saying an incantation, but Lloyd suddenly drifts through the air like a wisp of smoke, and he manifests behind the Lich. He uses a Kai breathing technique, but the Lich is surprised because he didn't notice Lloyd saying the incantation. While Lloyd thinks about how to combine Kai and magic techniques effectively, the Lick tries to attack him continuously. But Lloyd's barrier is impenetrable. The Lick can't believe how sturdy Lloyd's barrier is. Lloyd remembers Tao's advice about using Kai techniques, and he decides to focus on his breathing. He inhales deeper than he's ever done, and he uses a sprint spell to accelerate the process. Lloyd moves through the cave, trying to take in as much air as possible, and the Lick mistakes his actions as a plan to escape. He tries to attack Lloyd, but his attacks are still useless against Lloyd's barrier. Lloyd keeps practicing his breathing technique, inhaling and exhaling as much as he can. Tao stares in awe as Lloyd keeps breathing, but Lloyd realizes his barrier is hindering his breathing, so he dispels it. The Lick thinks that Lloyd has reached his limit, so he decides to use the opportunity to attack him with every possible spell. Lloyd grabs onto a stalactite, and he hangs from it, keeping up his breathing. The Lick's attacks are about to take Lloyd down, but he suddenly dodges all its attacks gracefully. Tao realizes that Lloyd was the one who dispelled his barrier so he could breathe in properly and build up more Kai. Lloyd combines his Kai and his mana as he keeps breathing and dodging the Lick's attacks. Lloyd is finally satisfied with his mana and Kai combination, and he's able to dispel the Lick's attacks. He's disappointed that the attack doesn't get to the Lick, so he decides to reduce the size and increase the range of his attack to make it more precise. He releases the combination strikes, but the Lick blocks it with his magic. Lloyd keeps releasing the strikes, but the Lick can continuously block the attacks. Lloyd smiles like a possessed maniac as he relishes his new experience with Kai. He's optimistic about experimenting more and having more fun, but the Lick can't believe that Lloyd is releasing so many attacks without saying any incantation. The Lick is surprised that Lloyd is using Kai even when he's a sorcerer. He's baffled that Lloyd's Kai even surpasses his sorcery. Lloyd makes his strikes sharper and thinner, and in a last-ditch effort, the Lick creates a barrier to protect himself. The strike cuts through the Lick's barrier and takes down the Lick. A treasure chest opens after they defeat the Lick, but all they see inside is a ragged dagger. Tao thinks it's a bust, but Lloyd decides to keep the dagger because he has some residual mana. The treasure suddenly closes and sinks into the ground. Lloyd realizes that the chest is trying to escape because it's the core of the dungeon, and he grabs onto it. He figures out that the treasure chest will live underground and consume magic items, then create a new dungeon. It will absorb all the equipment dropped by the adventurers and then grow bigger. The chest will then give up everything it has collected when the dungeon has been cleared and use that chance to escape. Lloyd is fascinated by the cycle of the chest, but Tao is more concerned about their lives. Lloyd manages to pull the chest from the dungeon floor before the roof of the dungeon begins collapsing. They manage to escape the dungeon on time before it's fully closed. Tao wonders why Lloyd used Kai techniques despite being a sorcerer. She thinks Lloyd was trying to get back at the Lick for mocking her, but Lloyd tells her he was just having fun. Lloyd suddenly remembers Grimoire is in trouble, and he informs Tao that he needs to attend to something urgently. Tao decides to train more and become strong enough so Lloyd will find her intriguing. Lloyd flies back home and enters the castle through his bedroom window, wondering if Grimoire is okay. He sees Grimoire lying on the ground, covered with bumps and bruises. Grimoire recalls how Silpha was so disappointed that Lloyd had gotten weaker during their training session. She chased Grimoire around, drilling him back to his former strength. Grimoire tells Lloyd he couldn't do anything against Silpha, and he blames his predicament on Lloyd for coming late. Lloyd apologizes for coming late. The next day, Lloyd and Grimoire are frolicking about the castle library. Grimoire looks unimpressed at the dagger that made Lloyd return home late, leading to his misfortune. Lloyd tries to convince him that the dagger is a valuable treasure. He decides to soak the dagger in hot water and then rub off the surface. After that, he's able to peel off the mana essence on the dagger that is a catalyst for enchantment. Weapons can be enhanced by writing spells on them using their essence. Lloyd reads the mana essence of the blade, and he realizes it was enchanted with reinforced strength. Grimoire thinks Lloyd will be able to experiment with enchantments now, but Lloyd tells him it's not that easy. He puts the mana essence of the blade in a flask containing water, and he uses his disassemble spell to break it down. Lloyd explains that he can't experiment because mana essence is expensive, and enchantments are prone to fail. He doesn't want to lose the weapon and its mana essence, so he decides to analyze the mana essence and mass produce it himself. He uses a water purification spell to separate the raw materials of the blade's mana essence. By increasing its purity, the essence is separated into oil, silver, and hematite. Grimoire recognizes hematite as powdered monster core, which is very rare. Lloyd informs Grimoire that he has the dungeon's treasure chest, which was its core, and he knows he can make hematite from that. They are both happy that all they need is just oil, silver, and a lot of weapons to enchant with mana essence. Lloyd goes to see his father to ask him for a favor. His father gives him a huge pouch of silver coins, wondering if he doesn't want gold coins instead. Lloyd tells him he's satisfied with silver coins, and he runs back to the library. The king realizes that Lloyd is very humble, and he wonders what he wants to use his pocket money for. Lloyd takes the silver coins to the secret library, where Grimoire helps him melt them into their liquid form. They are satisfied with the amount of silver in their possession. Later in the day, Lloyd and Silpha are engaged in the heat of training. Lloyd tries to use a sprint spell to get behind Silpha and launch a surprise attack, but she dodges it. Lloyd decides to use a morphing spell on the ground, which surprises Silpha. He's about to take her down and claim his prize when she suddenly disappears. Lloyd wonders where she is, but Silpha is chilling underneath him. She launches a surprise attack from underneath, which catches Lloyd off guard. Lloyd yields, but after the battle, Silpha still gives him a vase of oil. Lloyd wonders why she's giving him the oil when they agreed he'd only get it if he won a round against her when they sparred. Silpha tells him she doesn't mind giving him the prize because she's relieved that he isn't weak. She realizes that he was just having a bad day that day, and she's glad that her fears have been alleviated. Grimoire wonders how Silpha can still win against Lloyd even when he uses magic spells against her. He concludes that she has to be a monster in disguise since Lloyd is already so proficient in sorcery and sword mastery. Silpha is convinced that he will become very powerful when he grows up. Lloyd takes the oil, promising to show her the results of his work. He runs back to his secret lab in the library, and with the help of Grimoire, he mixes the oil with silver and hematite to create mana essence. The next day, he goes to see Prince Albert and asks him for help with a lot of weapons to practice sorcery. Prince Albert realizes that Lloyd loves sorcery a lot, and Lloyd is convinced that he'll be able to help him because he has royal guards that can lend him assistance. The guards give up their weapons, and they decide to forget about them because they don't think someone as young as Lloyd can pull off enchantments successfully. Lloyd puts his replica in auto-assistant mode as he prepares to enchant the swords. He notices that Grimoire is hyped for the enchantments, and he promises to deliver an enchanted sword worthy of his anticipation. Grimoire notices that Lloyd is engraving an absurd number of spells on the sword. Lloyd tries inscribing more spells, but the sword breaks, and Lloyd realizes he overdid it. Grimoire encourages him to continue enchanting since they only just started, and after a long while, Lloyd returns to Prince Albert with his result. Prince Albert is surprised that Lloyd was able to successfully enchant 50 weapons out of 120. He apologizes for destroying the 70 swords, but he knows he was able to successfully enchant the 80 swords. He overdid the enchantments on some of them, which made them break. Prince Albert is impressed that Lloyd could enchant so many swords because even a master enchanter only successfully enchants 10% of his weapons. The guards conclude that Lloyd is lying, which pisses Silpha off. But when one guard tries to sheath his sword, it cuts through the scabbard. Lloyd tells Prince Albert he wants to see the weapons in action, and Albert tells Lloyd to tag along with them because the king permitted him to go on a monster hunt. Watch this next video. See you on the next one.